Microphone. Hello, mostly for the online crowd and in case the crowd do pick up. Hi, my name's Mary. I'm on Lighthouse. I love the Overruled, and I am so thrilled to have Sam in the bookshop tonight. He is an old mate from times gone by, and so I'm thrilled to have somebody else who is completely unbiased doing the chairing to throw him the hard questions. So will you join me in welcoming Olivia and Sam for tonight's launch of Overruled?
Hi everyone, I'm Olivia. I'm a law student at the University of Edinburgh, and I want to thank Lighthouse Books for letting me have the honor of chairing this event. I'm just going to be doing some general questions about the general themes of the book, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards. So Sam, that's what we get started.
Let's do it.
Today we're talking about Overruled. A general theme you talk about is power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. What does this mean?
First, I think I probably need to hold my hands up and say I didn't actually come up with it.
Right.
Full disclosure. The quote is from Lord Acton, so I'm sure many people will know, who was actually writing to a mate in the 19th century. So they wrote things like that to their mates, and he was talking about the then Prussian state, which was governed by essentially a monarchy, but a particularly sort of controlling monarchy. And what essentially he was arguing was that power will always be misused unless there is something to stop it being misused. And I use that quote a lot, and I come back to it a lot because I think that's not necessarily the essence of democracy, but it's fundamental to making democracy actually work in practice. That to have that at the forefront of our minds. And I was going to say 90% of what I do, 100% of what I do, is trying to stop power corrupting, because that is what the public law of England and Wales and of Scotland is there to do. It's to make sure citizens can prevent their government from misusing power by breaking the law. But we can only do so much, and the other side of that coin has to be the political realm. And that's why accountability is so important for you, that unless people holding power are accountable for how they use that power, not just once every 4 years when we rock up to vote, if any of you are still allowed to vote in the next election, if you've got the correct ID, but in a day-to-day manner. And what I sort of argue throughout the book is that power has been corrupted, that we have the avenues of accountability, both on the legal side and the political side, and indeed the cultural side in the UK, have been eroded over the last, I sort of pick 10 years as a fairly arbitrary number of years, but you could make the argument for 20, 30, perhaps even more.
So you take us to this theme through your own personal accounts from various important case law. Sorry, the mic's not working. From the prorogation case to the Russian report case. When you were living these cases, did you ever think you would be in the position of writing a reflection on them?
Yeah, that's why I did it. No, firstly, when you're in the middle of a case like this, particularly something like the prorogation case or the Russia report case, you don't really get a chance to think about really anything else, because you live and die not even just the whole case, just the particular argument that you're writing at the time. But moreover, I think it was when I went to the bar, I did so because I had what turned out to be very naive, but certainly idealistic belief in the power of the law to protect democracy and protect people's rights and protect citizens. And the reason that I ended up writing the book was sort of, in a way, me working through the limitations of that I discovered, because the prorogation case being a good example, we were able to bring the executive, the prime minister, having for the first time since Charles I tried to dispense with Parliament and govern without the elected representatives of the people, to the extent that they actually do represent the people. But maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. And we had thought of that. We brought that back, and I thought this could be a huge turning point for democracy in the UK. And it turned out it was, but sort of in the wrong direction. Because that was reconstituted in the public mind, putting the representatives of the people back into power was reconstituted as a sort of attack on democracy, and the government that was at fault, and who, to be honest, I was fairly certain were going to resign as soon as that decision from the Supreme Court came through. Went on to win a landslide general election victory on the back of it, and so were rewarded for their actions. And so the book was very much me kind of trying to work through, I guess, the scales falling from my eyes a little bit, and trying to reevaluate what's going on.
In the book, when you're talking about trying to hold the government accountable, you say politicians don't lie, they bullshit. Can you tell us what that means? What's the difference between lying and BS?
Well, I mean, I would be fair to politicians, some of them do lie. No, the difference between lying and bullshit, I always find it easiest to understand. A liar acknowledges the truth by subverting it. For a bullshitter, the truth doesn't matter. It's just not a part of it. A bullshit discourse is one in which you're seeking to just try and convince, try to win by any means necessary. If you tell some or all of the truth in doing that, I mean, it's irrelevant, basically. And an example of how this works is, so as a barrister, I reckon, if I'm cross-examining someone who's lying to me, I reckon I would probably break them eventually. If I can't cross-examine the bullshitter, I've tried, and you just come off looking like an idiot, because it's a war you're always going to lose, and that is what it's happened, I think, to our public discourse, and the prorogation is a good example of that. But hey, let's take a more recent example from, I don't know, yesterday, when the recent Prime Minister, who is most famous for adding £200 a month to my mortgage, explained that actually the reason she crashed the economy in September wasn't because she totally ignored all of her advisors. It wasn't because she put through an uncosted budget. It was because of woke people. And this was a genuine speech that was made by a genuine former head of government, and was covered in every single news outlet, and worked for her. This is, yeah, sure, we're laughing about it now. There's people on Twitter kind of chuckling and taking the mick. But actually, Liz Truss is back on top of the news agenda. Liz Truss is right in the middle of the economic debate. And I think Rishi Sunak was getting questions about, would you put ex-prime ministers in the cabinets again? So it has paid off for Liz Truss. Bullshit works.
You talk about how private individuals, especially in the media, contribute to this forum. How would you say private media plays a role in circulating bullshit?
Well, I think there's sort of two sides to this. One is sort of content, and then the other is structure. And as a constitutional lawyer, I'm always looking at structures. And so this all came about. I started looking into this because of a case I argued for, actually representing Nicola Sturgeon. Which didn't ever get to come to Edinburgh to do it, but it was in 2019, and just before when the general election was called, the first general election debate. I think there was about a week's notice, maybe two, between the general election being called and the first televised debate. And ITV said, well, we reckon only Labour and the Conservatives have got a shot of winning this thing, so we're just going to have the leaders of those two parties in our opening debate. And the opening debate is key, right? That's the main one. It's the only one that happens before postal votes go in. It tends to set the tone of the election. Unsurprisingly, the leader of the party that just won a massive majority in Scotland was fairly miffed about this. The leader of the Liberal Democrats was fairly miffed about this, and the SNP instructed me and Philip Coppell, KC, and the Lib Dems instructed some of our colleagues, and we challenged this decision by judicial review. And the court said, oh, well, it's ITV is a private company. This is not judicially reviewable. And so Philip stood up and said, well, let me put this proposition to you. If that's what this is a quintessentially public issue, right? This is a general election debate. What would be the remedy if the day before the general election, ITV gave Boris Johnson 5 hours of airtime to use for himself? And the court literally says this in its judgment. There would be nothing that anyone could do about it, except for complaining to Ofcom afterwards. So this was a judgment, and I suppose I'm partly at fault because I should have argued the case better and won it, but I didn't. We lost. That said, it really confirmed, I think, something that had been apparent for a long time, which is that the private companies and private individuals that exercise enormous amounts of control over our discourse through news are in effect a law unto themselves, and they don't have a legal, at least, responsibility or duty to us as members of the public. And so I sort of started looking into this, and it turns out that when you look at it by audience, the vast majority, more than 90% of our media is controlled by 6 individuals. The majority of these individuals don't, certainly for tax purposes, live in the UK. And all of these individuals are able to exercise editorial influence, which means that the way we discover facts, right, the way we discover what's going on in the world, comes through the filter of what 1 of 6 people want us to think. And that is an incredibly powerful influence over democracy, because that is the ability to control public debate. And why this relates to bullshit is that those individuals and the individuals who work with them have made conscious decisions to promote bullshit discourses. You didn't have to put enemies of the people on the front of the Daily Mail. You didn't have to put 350 million on the front of the Sun. It's a deliberate choice that those who, I mean, it sounds really conspiratorial to say those who control the media, but actually those who literally control the media, because that's where the money goes, have made to misinform the public for particular political ends. And to the extent that you're actually better off making bullshit statements now to get media attention than you are making fact-based or analytical statements. And let me just give you one example of that from, again, this week. In Matthew Goodwin, who some of you may be unfortunate enough to have come across, is a real tribune for the people. He's been crushed, his spirit's been crushed, his voice has been crushed, his freedom of speech has been crushed, except for appearing in every single news program and getting a column in every single national newspaper, and having a job at the Legatum Institute, which is a think tank which is funded by a billionaire. He has written a book that argues that there is essentially a conspiracy to control the United Kingdom. And this is a conspiracy of the liberal elite who secretly control everything in the United Kingdom and essentially want to turn it. I'm pretty sure it doesn't quite say it in these many words, but the thesis seems to be want to turn everything again. Now, you don't need to sort of look at his sources or interrogate him or anything to know that this is obviously total rubbish. Right? There has been whether you don't have to be on the left or the right to sort of take a position on this. This isn't making a party political statement. It's true to say there have been right-wing governments in power for the last decade plus 3. There have been right-wing people in control of the arts budget, for example, in control of what culture gets funded. There have been right-wing people at the highest levels of the BBC. It's a fact that the BBC prioritizes, gives more airtime to right-wing viewpoints than to left-wing viewpoints. This isn't to say right-wing viewpoints are wrong and left-wing viewpoints are right. It's just how much airtime they get. So Goodwin is obviously full of bullshit. And yet, his thesis has been in a column in every single major news. Even The Guardian had a column from Goodwin. I mean, whoever his publicist is. And he has managed to make this a thesis that would not pass muster if an undergraduate came with it. One of the defining topics of conversation in the national debate for the last couple of weeks. And he's able to do that because he was given a platform to do so.
You mentioned a solution to holding the government accountable, to mitigating this BS, is enfranchising people to essentially do those things, to call people out on their BS, to hold the government accountable. How can this be done practically if the court of public opinion is so muddled by what they're fed?
Yeah, I think that's the real challenge, right? Because you've got to reform the sort of nuts and bolts of the constitution. You've got to reform the electoral system. You've got to reform the legal system. But that's all for nothing if the way we interact with those is based on fantasy. And so and it's much more difficult to kind of reform the way people think, and also really problematic to talk about reforming the way people think, than it is to just say, right, okay, well, from the next election, we're doing this by proportional representation. So I think 2 things are really important. One is education and particularly critical thinking. And one of the things I think I touch on in the book, but I think there's much more to be said about it, is the way that education, both in high school and at university level, has been sort of reformed over the last 10 to 15 years to eliminate critical thinking. And so for example, public funding for subjects like history, which I studied, social sciences, has been cut almost, if not completely, to 0. So those are only funded by either loss-making or funded by fees now. And critical thinking has also been slowly phased out of the high school curriculum in favour of just rote learning, essentially. And so putting critical thinking back in as a skill, that's really important. But I think we need to go further and find a way to sort of dismantle the perverse incentives bullshit at the sort of macro levels. One of which is, I think, control of the press. So one of the things I advocate for is, essentially, ironically, I'm much more, because I get called a lefty lawyer a lot. In this, I'm more capitalist than the capitalists, in that I want proper competition rules for the media. I advocate essentially breaking up monopolies, but judging those monopolies by audience size. But also, I think we need to punish politicians who try and take advantage of this. So one of the things I've argued for is, I didn't come up with this. The books editor at the Guardian called it this, but he called it truth law. But what I argued for was making a false statement should be in public, negligently or deliberately, should be a form of misconduct in public office. And the reason that's so obviously you can't prosecute ordinary people for lying unless they lie to make a load of money. But politicians, MPs or councillors, anyone holding elected office, have voluntarily chosen to take on public trust and take on a position and be rewarded for a position of enormous public trust. So they should be held to a higher standard. It's perfectly easy to correct the record. You can always go back to Parliament and say, I got this wrong. This is what I should have said. And yet politicians always choose not to do that. And so there should be I think there should be consequences for sort of playing fast with the truth for the political game.
Yeah, with all of these, we've talked about different themes you've had in your book. The title of your book being The Vanishing of Democracy. You talk about this slow burn effect. How do all of these things, how does the snowball become the avalanche? How do these things roll up into one big issue? What do you think is the main problem at the end of the day that we're looking from all these things tying together?
Well, that's sort of the point. There isn't ever going to be a main problem. It's really an interesting. There's a really interesting study about how democracies essentially turn into autocracies or authoritarian states, and this happens much more than you'd expect. And it's only about 10% of the time that it happens with tanks rolling through the capital city. Military coups or other sorts of coups are an incredibly rare form of democracy ending. What happens much more often, and by far the majority of cases, is you just, at some point, you tip over into not being a democracy. And so take Hungary, for example. Hungary is a democracy to all intents and purposes. It calls itself a democracy. But it's very difficult to see how anyone who is not the governing party would ever win an election there. Similarly, Russia is a democracy. Vladimir Putin is an elected leader. But again, it is entirely impossible to imagine how anyone other than Vladimir Putin would win an election that stood in. So, but there wasn't in both of those countries, there wasn't a coup. There wasn't ever one big moment that led to it. It was, the frog in the boiling water that just doesn't realise they're being cooked and need to jump out. And that's why even small bits of chiseling away at democracy are so important, and it's so important to fight these things. So even something as small as, for example, different types of voter ID. This was a law that didn't even need to pass Parliament. It's secondary legislation, but it was the decision that various forms of ID for people over 60 would count as ID for voter ID, but the equivalent forms for people under 60 would not count. Now that's a tiny, technical, quite boring issue, right? But it's incredibly important because it comes in the context of 10, 20, 30 other equally technical, perhaps boring legislative changes, legal changes that make it harder for us to decide the people who are currently in power who don't want to be in power. We'd like to change that, please. And that is becoming increasingly difficult in this country. In fact, I was quite worried about the next general election, but I think democracy has been very fortunate in its opponents, and we are fortunate to have had people with anti-democratic instincts who are totally incompetent at using power once they have got it. And it's only through just a series of unbelievably disastrous public policy decisions that they have managed to turn enough people off that the next election may indeed be a real contest. But that's only because the opposition currently have 25-point lead. If this were a 4-point game, I would be very surprised if the party that was not the party of government could win the next election.
Is there ever a point of no return with this?
I'd like to think there's not. I'd like to think there's never a point of no return, because democracy is, it's much as so I grew up in the in the 90s and early noughties, and I think there was a point where even though we didn't, I'm not sure we all really understood the idea, but we believed, everyone kind of believed the end of history idea. It felt like we've got to the end of history, we've got to the point, right? But that's just not the way things work. Things go in cycles, and just as we learned that our polity could regress, so I think our polity can improve. Of course, the danger is that after a point, once you exclude people enough from democratic, peaceful political engagement, then that provides an incentive to violence. And so that it wouldn't be a point of no return, but it would be a point I wouldn't want to get to, was where people see no way to interact with the state, no way to kind of exercise control over their own destiny other than by violence, because that is counterproductive for everyone.
Earlier, you mentioned there's many different definitions of democracy. In your book, you refer to, in the United States, constitutional law being democracy as a foundation, whereas in the United Kingdom, it's more of a lodestar. Can you contrast those two theories for us?
Yeah. So this is it took me quite a while to kind of figure this out, because when I started writing this book, I still had this end of history idea in my mind that when I was going to school, when I started university, we were in the epitome of democracy, and we sort of moved away from it. And I had to start kind of unpick that. And once I kind of started looking through things that I knew already, historic cases that I knew about, history that I'd studied, it became very clear to me that in the UK, democracy is, in the grand scheme of things, sort of a historical aberration. We've only been a democracy, or something approaching a democracy, for a very short period of time. And the UK as a whole isn't designed to be a democracy. That's not how our constitution is designed. Our legislature, retainers, hence why we call them the Commons. Our executive is designed to be the monarchy, and our legal system is was originally designed to be run by their mates. And we've, in the 20th century, we made incredible strides at sort of chipping away at that. In that we in the legal system, we created a system whereby the government could be challenged in court. The Commons was democratized, so people got to vote for who goes in. But it was only in the early part of the 20th century that actually more people had a vote didn't. So that's a fairly recent thing. Of course, we have the Parliament Acts, still kept the House of Lords. We still have a legislature in which one entire house is appointed by the government, which is, if you were to put any name other than the United Kingdom on the front of that description, you would think you were talking about a tin pot dictatorship. But we passed the Human Rights Act. We made strides forward, and so it seemed to me that we never quite got to being a democracy. We never designed a state to be a democracy, or designed a constitution to be a democracy. But we at least moved in that direction. The contrast, the reason I use America or France, for example, as helpful contrasts, is that they both had democratic moments. There was a moment in both of those states where they sat down and said, we're going to sit down and have a conversation about what this whole thing looks like, what the whole country looks like, and we are going to start from a position of democracy. That's not to say it worked, and I'm not holding the United States up as a sort of, gold standard or silver standard or, I don't know, uranium standard. And there's lots of very interesting reasons for that. But there is a contrast in that there is at the heart of the United States Constitution is at least the acknowledgement that all, well, it says all men technically, but let's say all people are basically of equal value. And which is the essence of democracy. Whereas at the heart of the British Constitution is the monarchy, where one guy is of much more value than all of the rest of you. So there is a contrast that we have to get around. This isn't to sort of argue that the British Constitution is terrible and the American one's great or anything like that. It's to just try and a way to sort of understand some of the problems that we face.
What are then the dangers of having a written UK constitution?
Anyone familiar with Antonin Scalia? No? Yes, well done. Antonin Scalia was an American judge who created a constitutional theory called originalism. And this was the idea, and he was a Supreme Court judge. And this has become arguably the dominant legal theory in the United States, which is in interpreting the written constitution, we must ask ourselves, what would the founders have thought? And it was really interestingly, it turns out that American founders have all the same prejudices as Antonin Scalia. Just in much the same way that people that use religion to justify homophobia. It turns out Jesus has all the same prejudices as Marjorie Taylor Greene. So that's the problem with a written constitution. Basically, is it creates the possibility for that to happen, and it prevents or provides tools for preventing a polity from evolving to address new issues. Because smart as Alexander Hamilton was, I don't think he ever anticipated Bitcoin. So that said, the British way is also really problematic, where we don't have anything, and essentially a huge part of our constitution is kind of trusting people in power to do the right thing, which, going right back to the start of this conversation, is a terrible idea. So what I propose or prefer is a binding statement of constitutional principles. So not an instruction manual, but some essential principles and things like human rights, the rule of law, sovereignty of parliament, as a way, and this will allow future both form a framework for a future political debate and constitutional democratic debate about what we want the country to look like, but also provide a clear tool for the courts. Because at the moment, whenever a court makes a decision that is inconvenient for the government, it is dismissed as interfering in politics. And that's really, really difficult as a lawyer to argue against. It's so incredibly difficult to convince a court that the point you're putting to them is a legal point, not a political point, when the other guy can stand up and say, yeah, but if you rule against it, it's going to embarrass the Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. And what a binding statement of constitutional principle would do would make the court's role very, very clear. And it would essentially just remove this debate about what's political, what's not. Is the court being political? Is the court not? Because it wouldn't matter. The court's job in constitutional cases would be to apply the constitutional principle in the context of whatever legal question that it was being asked to answer. And so it would make the court's role as a sort of referee much more effective, and it would make my life a lot easier.
Well, looking at time, I just have one more question before I hand it to the audience. So with all these themes we've looked at, you say democracy derives power from the people. And in your foreword, you say democracy as a way of life. And we've talked about these political solutions and framework that are ultimately in the hands of the government, three branches of government. How can we as individuals take this as a call to action? What can we do to put democracy in our everyday lives?
This is the conundrum, right? You read a book that says, "Oh, you've been completely disempowered. Now go and do something about it." But this isn't Hungary. It's not Russia. It's not Poland. We're very much still in the game. There are local elections coming up in a few weeks. There is a general election coming up at least by the end of 20. It's any longer. So there is going to be an opportunity. But in order to make the most of that opportunity, we need engaged citizenry. Democracy actually only works when we all take part in it on sort of everyday basis. And that's not standing up on Speaker's Corner and annoying everybody. It's the conversations you have with your friends, with your colleagues. It's how you choose to, if you make charitable donations, who you make those charitable donations to, who you buy stuff from. All of these things are incredibly important. And there are, in a more practical sense, there are a huge number of organizations that are attempting to democratize and promote democracy. And all of them are massively outmatched because they don't have the money of Policy Exchange or the IEA or the Taxpayers Alliance. They're floating by on a shoestring. That's not to say, go and give them a load of cash, but it is to say, go on their websites, maybe volunteer, just maybe engage in some way. That's really important and really helpful. One of the things I did after writing the book was set up a think tank to promote democratic thought leadership and new democratic ideas called the Institute for Constitutional and Democratic Research. And we also worked with parliamentarians, various MPs, to form an all-party parliamentary group on democracy and the Constitution. And so we have been involved in that debate and in trying to promote democratic ideas and come up with ways of reforming our law to better reflect democracy and human rights. So we were on the internet, Google ICDR, and you can see our website, and please do come and please do sign up to our mailing list and come and look at our events and get involved.
Sam, it was a pleasure both to read your book and to interview today. I'm going to hand it to the audience. We all have any questions?
Any burning ones? There's a couple online, but yeah, if you want to go first.
So I'm going to slightly plead the fifth and dodge that question for professional reasons, because I'm instructed by multiple different political parties, because I have a role in Parliament. I'm not going to promote or criticise a particular political party. So I won't give my opinions on Keir Starmer. Although he set up Dow Street, and that's a really good section. It's the most I'll say. But in terms, I think what your question goes more deeply to is demanding making the political parties in Westminster better reflect your values and what you're thinking about. And that is a challenge for everyone. Partly that's because of our electoral system that is set up to so that our political parties don't actually represent what the country thinks. And I think I did actually look this up. It was it's not since 1936 has the party of government actually received a majority of votes in a general election. So I'm sure there are lots of other political parties that are perhaps closer to what you to your personal beliefs, but they're being locked out by this archaic system, and that's really problematic. So I think campaigning for voting reform is a really important way to go about that. That is probably the one biggest sort of key that would open that. But if there's another one, it's funding. And the fact is, the two biggest political parties control all the money. All of the donations goes to them. It's incredibly difficult to say you were to, take what your position and say, I'm sick to death of everyone in Westminster. No one respects my values. I'm starting my own political party, the Awesome Ideas Party.
Mhm.
It would be so difficult for you to get anywhere, to just raise money to get people to buy rosettes or posters, let alone actually get campaigns started. And so reforming the way our political parties are funded is an enormously important thing that I think we need to do. And shameless plug, the ICDR has a very good paper about reforming political funding, where we argue for that political donations should be capped at the level that the poorest in society can afford. And I think that if we did that, you'd see a much more equitable and representative spread of money in politics, and you might be able to get the Awesome Ideas Party off the ground.
Given what you said about proportional representation and a written constitution of sorts, do you see Scotland as a shining light?
In the proportional representation sense, yeah, absolutely. Because it was an experiment in proportional representation and in putting that into practice. And the biggest argument that is made against the biggest argument against proportional representation that's generally made is, what if someone I don't like gets into power? That's problematic for obvious reasons. But the other argument that's often made against PR is, it makes it really difficult to govern. And no one can make decisions. Everyone sort of just argues all the time. There's never a consensus. And Scotland has sort of shown that's not true. It is, one may disagree with various decisions that Scottish governments have taken. One may agree with them. That's sort of not the point. They've been able to make their decisions, have their ideas, and put those ideas into practice within the framework of devolution. So in that sense, I think it's been a really positive experiment. In terms of constitutional reform, I think Scotland has a lot further to go. For example, it's got a unicameral, only one House of Parliament, right? There's the Scottish Parliament has got only one house. In terms of checks and balances, I think you would want to look at developing that. But maybe I'm just being naive here, but there seems to be more open-mindedness in Scotland to sort of constitutional experimentation and development. And I think that's a really positive thing as well.
We've got a couple online while you guys are having a think. One is from Layla. Education and a few other things you mentioned seem a pretty long game when the crisis just now is so urgent. How do we navigate more concrete reform when those with power to reform would reform in their favour?
Well, that comes back to our little catch-22, doesn't it? The answer is, you won't change any of this there's sort of two problems. One is structural, so you're not going to change the perverse incentives overnight. What you have, the only way to address that is to bring people into power who are more open to it. So now I'm not saying you'll get people in power who are going to say, yes, fantastic, PR, do it tomorrow. Brilliant, statement of constitutional principles, write it out, just email it to me, stick it on the statute book. It's not going to go that way. But what you might get is people who are more open to having that conversation, and more open to going a few steps down the road. And so engaging in and campaigning to vote out politicians who are opposed to or closed off to democratic reform is really the only thing we can do in the short term. I've sent my wife to sleep with that answer, by the way.
Someone else has picked up, I think, on something else you were saying. Talat, there seem a few other Davids in the fight against Goliath, and they pick out Byline Times and the Good Law Project. Do we join their fights? Are there more effective ways to work on accountability for the everyman?
Well, Joe Mong will be delighted that the questioner has used that specific language, because his book is called Bringing Down Goliath. So he thinks of himself as David in the fight against Goliath, and rightly so. So both of these are organisations which are go into that category of organisation that I was talking about earlier. The Good Law Project does an incredibly important job, because in I think it was 2012, the Cameron government essentially eliminated legal aid for public law. This was, again, one of those kind of boring, kind of technical little reforms, but it was massively important, because it meant that only people who were rich enough and legal aid costs, if you're lucky, legal aid costs tens of thousands. If you're not, it costs hundreds of thousands. Judicial review costs, if you're lucky, costs hundreds of thousands. So most people are now unable to take the government to court when the government acts unlawfully towards them. The Good Law Project stepped into that gap and essentially holds the government to account for breaches of the law on the public's behalf. Yes, it's not ideal, because actually ideally any member of the public would be able to enforce their own rights. That's where you want to get to, but we're not there yet. So we've got to take a few steps along the path. So supporting the Good Law Project is hugely important. Organisations like Byline Times, and I'd also throw in Open Democracy in there, are doing the most incredible investigative journalism on a complete shoestring budget. Work that the Panorama should be doing is being done, in an office in Kentish Town. Mm-hmm. That's the work. We actually worked quite closely with Open Democracy in when we were doing our work on political funding, because they've been instrumental in exposing the various different avenues of political funding. I think in an ideal world, that's what the news media would look like. Open Democracy and groups like that, small publications that are investigating, challenging, holding power to account, asking questions, and are beholden to nobody. And if they're not supported, we will lose them completely.
Another one in the room? If not, I've got another follow-up from Jen. It does seem we need to change who goes into government. I learned so much about behind the scenes of those doing good governance in your book, but those people always get overshadowed by the bullshitters. Do you have any advice?
We have advice about changing the government.
Or maybe who goes into it, or the qualifications that people going into government would need or we value.
Yeah, I think the two different contrasting things you picked up there are really important. The qualifications they would need and the qualifications we value are really two different things. The qualification Boris Johnson, the qualifications we value was what? Being funny on Have I Got News for You? He wasn't even that funny. The qualifications that people need, I think, are many and varied. And this is actually the point, right? There isn't one set of qualifications that people need. That you can't just, much as I would be tempted to say, yeah, well, put the barristers in there, that we'll sort it out. That's not right. Because you need teachers, you need doctors, you need students, you need bricklayers, you need people that have worked for local councils, you need people that have negotiated international treaties. You need all of these sorts of people in Parliament. What you don't need are people who came straight out of university, worked for an MP for 10 minutes, and then got a safe seat. And this, I think, this sort of comes back to the perverse incentives in Parliament, that we have the way to get a seat, the way to get selected is to be a party person, to follow the line, to be a good soldier. Those are qualities that once you get into Parliament will again serve you very well, because once you're in Parliament, the way to get promoted to Parliamentary Private Secretary, to Junior Minister, to Secretary of State, are to follow the party line, be a good soldier, kind of try and own the other side on Twitter or on Question Time.
Mm-hmm.
These are qualities that make terrible legislators. They're the opposite of the qualities that you need for good legislators, because good legislators should not follow the line. They should challenge, they should ask questions. They should be kind of annoying a lot of the time for those in power. Similarly, those in power, the executive, we are again recruiting from these, the insiders, the sheep, because those are the people that get all the way to the top. So you then find that you have a government that's made up of people who have no skill except for advancing in the political system. And so when they come, and it was really, one of the things I thought was very interesting about the COVID crisis was you had a government that had spent its entire lifetime creating and arguing about fake crises and fake problems, was suddenly confronted with a genuine existential threat. And what did it do? It kind of faffed about for 3 months. And then in the newspapers today, we have a report revealing that we've got a diabetes crisis in the UK. Again, that the government warned about years and years and years ago and didn't do anything about. We have an economic crisis that was predicted and no one did anything about, because our political system incentivizes people to get to the top who completely lack skills to do so. So how do we change that? Well, you've got to get better people. You've got to support better people. And this really involves engagement on a local level. It goes right down to local councillors, asking what sort of person is this local councillor? Is it someone who is just, on the first step to their MP seat, or is it your local GP? Is it someone with experience that will equip them for the job? And the same goes for MPs. Now, all of you can have a role in choosing who gets to run as MPs. It's the MPs the candidates are chosen by local selection committees. So if whatever political party you identify with, or even maybe identify with a bit, if you join that party and start to get involved in the internal voting and the selection of MPs, you can determine who gets to run for Parliament. And you can have them stood in front of you and say, hey, what have you done? Have you ever run a business? Have you ever worked for a business? What makes you equipped to go and ultimately make decisions that are going to affect my life and livelihood? But so long as we say, well, you know, they're all terrible and this is a terrible system, and sort of use that as a reason to step back, well, then the only people deciding who goes forward are going to be those who think that being kind of smart and bygone for you is good enough.
I think, unless there's any more burning questions in the room. Oh, there's one last one.
Projects like the Good Law Project, because I think it tells the structure was exact. There was a where they would go to the judge and they being correct. The judge said something that they did, and obviously those who would support the Good Law Project would have what the press releases. So I was wondering what's on that and also about the fact that organizations like that might overestimate or overstate the success of the street.
Yeah.
Yeah, David apologize. That was a really, really important point to make. In fact, it was two really, really important points to make. Yeah, I've disagreed with Joe on various different issues. The reason I still sort of get behind it, for all, you know, and he will be the first to admit that he's made a lot of mistakes, but that's sort of the point. He will admit it. And if you like, his book is coming out, might already be out actually, but he, you know, there's almost an entire chapter kind of devoted to all the times he screwed up in his life. And it was sort of my favorite chapter of the book because it was so strange to see and welcome to see a, you know, someone who is very powerful and very privileged kind of doing that, holding their hands up. And I know the judgment that you're quoting, and the Good Law Project rightly held up their hands and said we messed this one up when they were called out on it. So that's what sort of gives me hope about the Good Law Project, if you like, that they are kind of different from their critics in that they are willing to say when they got it wrong. Yes, they're definitely going to be very enthusiastic about their prospects of success. We all are. But you're absolutely right when you say it's really difficult to bring a claim against the government. And I give this advice to all clients who are thinking about it, whether that's local government, national government, you know, the EU, whatever. You have a mountain to climb. It's very, very difficult to win against the government. Partly because they've got more resources from you, but partly because we still have a presumption in our legal system that what the government says is right and is true and is to be relied on. And there's a good reason for that. I don't necessarily agree with it, but there is a good reason for it. But I think there's a broader point that you raise, which is the problem with organisations like the Good Law Project, is that any concentration of power is problematic for democracy, whether that is government power or whether that's private power. And the Good Law Project, because it has stepped in to fill a role that should be taken up by lots and lots of citizens from lots and lots of different perspectives, because it is acting in that way, it has become powerful and it has become a centre of power in and of itself. And it's not necessarily accountable. Now, I would certainly, you know, trust Joe more than I'd trust someone running the Daily Mail or a think tank. But we have to be equally forthright and equally critical of those that we like or those that we support as those we don't support. And so I think perhaps the best thing I could say for the Good Law Project, and it's not, I keep mentioning Joe, but it's the Good Law Project is not just Joe. There's loads of really, really talented lawyers who are working as part of it. The best thing I can say for them is they would be the first to want to make themselves obsolete. If they could see a way, if they have the opportunity of saying, the government will fund legal aid properly, so anyone can bring a claim against the government if they need to, if it's meritorious, and we no longer need to exist. I think that would be Christmas.
I think that's us.
Well, I will try and hold it just a sec. Thank you so much for that, Olivia. Well done on your first go with me. Thank you, Sam. That was in equal parts inspiring and really, really depressing.
That's nothing.
Like the book. Thank you all for coming. Sam is going to stick around and sign his book. So if you had a book that you wanted scribbled in, or you know an MP or someone that you should be throwing it at, then he can also sign that. And if you can't afford a copy of the book and you wanted to pass it on or take it home, then we do have a gift board system. So everyone can get a book if they want a book. Will you join me for one final big round of applause to Sam Hanks?